Today we begin our exploration of the Flesh Eater Courts. Those twisted, cannibalistic souls that stalk the mortal realms. Theirs is a tale of madness, survival, tragedy, and horror. It's the kind of army full of terrible people that you are equally likely to pity and also hate. And the tale of this army begins with one character, known only as the Carrion King. Carrion, of course, referring to the flesh of dead animals and such. Which, of course, doesn't set a great tone for the story we're going to dive into. But I'm getting ahead of myself because our story actually begins before he became the monster, back in the age of myth. There once was a vampire who became a favored servant of Nagash. Now, if you know much about Nagash from the Legion of Nagash books, Soul Wars novels, whatever, etc., you understand how rare it is to be a favored servant of his, and he went by many names. Sumeros, the Summer King, the Blood Rose Prince, Ushoran the Handsome, just to name a few, and he was a very handsome, charming, charismatic vampire and a creature of the night. He had his own little fiefdom, little kingdom, and he was a just and noble ruler of it. That doesn't mean he wasn't a vampire who spilled blood and things like that, but he was an honorable being. His court was full of knights and nobles, and they were resplendent in the darkness of Shyish. Now, how he fell from this graceful position is a mystery, but it's debated by many. It's widely believed that he fell out of favor with Nagash somehow, and his punishment was this horrible disfigurement, where once he was fair and handsome, he had become a hideous wretch and a beast. Now, we learned much about Nagash's sense of justice in the Nighthaunt books, and this really isn't too far out of the realm of possibility, especially if the events that led him to fall from grace were something to do with vanity and those kinds of self-loving things. And you can obviously see someone who their looks are very important to them, so the eternal punishment would be an eternity of being hideous. This is something Nagash would entirely do, so it lines up. The punishment filled the Blood Rose Prince, who's kind of like the name I like the most, so we're going to go with that a little bit. The Blood Rose Prince with an unholy anger. When your looks are that integral to your character and that's stripped away from you for an eternity, you tend to lose it. To get back at Nagash, he carved a swath of destruction across Shyish. His entire kingdom rallied to war, and they went basically targeting all of Nagash's favored cities, places that openly worshipped him as sole deity. He toppled cities, teared down edifices and statues to Nagash. The Battle Tome says he tore down scores of cities, loyal to the god and his servants, which is a lot of destruction to get out before earning Nagash's ire, which of course he did. Nagash can't stand for this to go on for very long. But like I said, we know Nagash, and he would never show the mercy of simply killing the vampire. That's not enough. It has to be an eternal punishment. And so instead, Nagash locks him up in a very special prison called the Shroud Cage. It's described as a towering edifice of broken promises, which is of course a little bit abstract, but it's a very cool place. Imagine a room full of mirrors. Every side of this jail cell, floor and ceiling included, is a mirror, and what it reflects back to you is every promise you've ever broken and every lie you've ever told. And it's this constant barrage of everything that's wrong with you. And of course, not only are you seeing all your internal flaws being reflected by all the promises and stuff you've broken, the lies you've told, but also it's reflecting what you look like because it's still a mirror. And of course, you're seeing your horrible physical look as well as your horrible internal character. The first curse, the one that destroyed his appearance, it broke his body, right? The thing that he held on to as being very valuable. The second curse, being in this prison, broke his mind. And the vampire laid there, reduced to a raving wreck. He's broken in mind, spirit, and body. Now, we know how Nagash doles out punishments, and when he gives out a punishment, it is forever. But with the ebb and flow of battle, things had changed. War had come to the mortal realms with the start of the Age of Chaos. There was a great battle called the Battle of the Burning Skies, where Nagash was supposed to show up and help the Pantheon, but he declined to show up so that the Pantheon would fall and he could ultimately take control. Sigmar gets ticked and goes to Shyish to hunt out Nagash. I tell you all this because during that pivotal moment, it's still the Age of Chaos, but the gods are now fighting amongst each other. Sigmar versus Nagash is when the forces of order, long before the Stormcast Eternals, arrive in Shyish and find this weird, towering edifice they don't understand. This battle erupts at the base of the Shroud Cage, and ultimately the prison fortress is destroyed in the process. The once noble vampire, now broken in so many ways, manages to escape and flee, while the forces of death and order are all distracted by each other. And he now becomes what we know as the Carrion King. Finally free, he's able to start rebuilding his court and household once again. But where do you begin? Of course, the easiest subjects to find are the destitute, the needy, the starving, and the pitiful. Those who just are desperate for someone, a being of magnificence and power to come in, take them under their wing, and show them a better life. Be a good king, be a good sovereign to us. And as I said, this is the age of chaos. It's in full swing. There's no shortage of desperate, starving souls. Refugees from hundreds of tribes and cities dotted the realms. And the Carrion King spoke to them at their most basic need, which is, of course, food, survival. Of course, the exact start of the first court is lost to time, but we know he offered these desperate survivors a dark meal. It was made from their own dead, or even the dead of their enemies. Either way, it was blatant cannibalism. With no home, no crops, or hope, the survivors had little choice. They partook of this evil feast, and something very unexpected happened, and it's this moment that I'm going to refer to during this week called the divergence. This moment where reality and your perception split in very different ways. The time the Carrion King spent in the Shroud Cage didn't just break him, it created a new kind of vampire. It altered his lineage. See, all Soulblights have some kind of connection to their sires, those who made them. It's a lineage, like a cursed bloodline often is the kind of terminology you'll see. They share traits, attributes, skills, and more. And the effects of the Shroud Cage affected the Carrion King, but it also affected anyone that he is going to create or turn into a vampire later on. Whenever a person drinks of his blood or partakes in this feast, they are somehow psychically almost connected to the Carrion King. They are immediately drawn into the madness that broke his mind. We'll go into more detail on the nature of this delusion tomorrow, but I wanted to start here because this story about the Carrion King does a few big things that really make it cool. First off is that he has a really possibly tragic story. We know that he was handsome, noble, not nice, but he was an honorable Soulblight, and at some point he was the favorite of Nagash. And we learned from the Night Haunt series, that's where you want to be. There are very few people in his favor, and there's a whole lot of people who have earned his ire. You want to be in his favor. But somehow he fell from grace and was punished twice over for it. First his looks, and then his mind. This story affirms the punitive nature of Nagash, and this book came out years before Legion of Nagash, or Night Haunt, or even many of the stories that we have involving him. So I love that it really solidifies his nature as the punisher of souls for eternity. I also enjoy the fact that this faction has a pretty clear origin date. A lot of sub-factions we'll see like Sylvaneth, they've just kind of always been around because Age of Myth is so loose that it doesn't really matter when Alarielle first planted this, Sylvaneth groves, for example. But I love factions where we some cause and effect made this happen at a particular time. And while this doesn't fit on a specific calendar date, there are enough memorable events nearby to pretty well place it. It's at the end of the Age of Myth. Age of Chaos has begun. The Battle of the Burning Skies has commenced. Sigmar was defeated there. He's now marching on Shyish, which is a time and a place that we know almost nothing about. I wish we would explore that some more. That moment where Sigmar is so enraged by Nagash's betrayal that he marches on Shyish instead of fighting Chaos like he should have been. But we also know that Sigmar wasn't there for long because things kind of cascaded in a very bad way, and so right after this moment, he would have gone and locked up Azir and started creating the Stormcast Eternals, who of course didn't exist at this point. His presence in Shyish, which couldn't be accounted for, incidentally created this entire new faction. If he had never showed up to destroy the castle, the Shroud Cage, there's no telling that the Carrion King would have just been sitting in that prison for eternity. And I like this. I like when we see events that create new factions. Just like in real life, as cause and effect create different splinter groups and things like that, the same thing's happening in the mortal realms. And it's really fun to watch, again, the cause and effect game play out in interesting ways. Because fundamentally, it was the accident that spawned this entire thing. I'm sure if Sigmar knew that he was going to create an entire new army of death that he had to fight, he would not have torn down the Shroud Cage. But in doing so, Sigmar incidentally unleashed a new horror on the mortal realms, someone who preys upon the weakest of the weak, who Sigmar himself is trying to defend. It kind of adds to the overall drama of the gods and the factions beneath them. And my last bit here is that I love the fact that this origin story is based on a death army that hates Nagash. Right? Because every other being with a conscience or a soul worships Nagash. Nagash is all are Nagash. And while we will explore this a little bit, some Flesh Eater courts do revere Nagash, but many of them don't. And regardless of whether they currently do or don't, the Carrion King exists because he fell from grace from Nagash and went on a campaign to destroy everyone who worships him. So fundamentally, whether they've changed their minds or not, hating him is part of their origin stories, no matter how they turned out. And that puts them in pretty stark contrast when it comes to something like Nighthaunt, who are specifically worshipping Nagash to be part of his vanguard, and then the endless hordes of skeletons and things like that who just don't really have a conscience enough to resist. They also toe the line between a living and undead in the sense that every person in this faction is a living being. The only undead things are the Ghoul Kings, who we're going to talk about later. They're the vampires who lead each household, but fundamentally, these are all living creatures that are just broken in terrible and horrific ways. And seeing how they fit into a death army is fascinating and rewarding. So if you like this video and you want to learn more about Flesh Eater courts, be sure to give it a like and subscribe, and follow along with me as we dive into the Flesh Eater courts over the next week or two. There'll be some other content interspersed here and there, but fundamentally this is going to be my main focus for a little bit, because this is one of the most fascinating factions out there, because their themes of insanity and perception and reality are some of the darkest fantasy tropes out there, and they're absolutely fun to dig into. And if you really like this video, invite a friend who plays Flesh Eater courts or is interested in them to join along. Thank you all so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in tomorrow's video.